Now I have to get put together here. I have an optical device called bifocals that I must put on my face. We were so pleased to be able to do this exhibition called Rembrandt Century in conjunction with the wonderful Mauritshuis exhibition. And most of you probably know this, but I'll just take a second to mention that the Achenbach Foundation for the Graphic Arts is the Department of Works on Paper for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. It has a name that sounds like a very independent entity, but we are part of the Fine Arts Museums, and we're located at the Legion of Honor. We have exhibitions in both venues, as well as a study room where you can make an appointment and come and look at works on paper. And we have a wonderful support group called the Graphic Arts Council. So if any of you are really interested in what we do in the Achenbach, I encourage you to check out the Graphic Arts Council, a great organization. They have their own website, which you can Google to find out more. Now, rather than give you an overview of Rembrandt's Century, I decided to focus on one section of the show, the final section as it happens, the Art of Darkness, and just to tease the theme of the Art of Darkness out a little bit further. And I'm going to be showing you some works that are in the exhibition, and I'm also going to be including some other works that are not actually here, and I'll try to point those out so that you don't get your heart set on seeing them next door. And with that, I will try to advance to the first slide. And as it happens, this painting by Peter Paul Rubens, which is not here in San Francisco, was acquired by the Mauritshuis in 2005, and so in 2014 you can go to The Hague and see it. And I wanted to start with a sort of look at some of these pictures that were done in the 17th century that deal with artificial light and darkness. This is a major theme, particularly in Dutch painting, but it's an international trend as well. And this is a fascinating little painting that was done by Rubens in the mid-16 teens after he'd been to Italy. So he'd seen the works of Caravaggio, and he came back and was interested in showing that he too could paint these very magical pictures in which lighting effects are palpable, a kind of tour de force of candlelight, casting shadows and giving reflections and so forth and so on. And here you see that the source of light is the single candle held by the old woman, which is then lighting the candle of the young boy. It's one of these pictures where there's a contrast between young and old, beautifully painted, where the texture of the old woman's skin has got this leathery quality, and the young boy, the very smooth and pink cheeks. This was a painting that Rubens seemed somehow special to Rubens from the outset, because it's painted on panel, but it's not painted on a single panel. It's actually painted on 21 separate pieces of wood that were all put together. Very unusual and not a terribly professional piece of work, that panel. So probably a picture that he never intended to sell to anybody, and in fact, he never did. He kept it until the end of his life, and it remained in his own collection, in his own studio. But although he didn't sell the painting, he commissioned an engraving, and the engraving is in my exhibition, Rembrandt's Century. And it's by Paulus Pontius, who is a professional reproductive engraver, one of the finest, an artist who became Rubens' primary engraver in the mid-1620s after Rubens got in a fight with Lucas Voorsterman, his previous house engraver. And we know that Pontius even lived in Rubens' household for 7 years, was a very important part of Rubens' operation, let's say. And Rubens had him make this engraving. So although the painting never left Rubens' studio, the engraving went out into the world and was seen by many people, and it was really one of the first of these Caravaggesque pictures done in the Netherlands. The print, when it was published, was given a Latin inscription, as so many of these things have, and it's taken from Ovid's Art of Love. It says, "Who forbids the taking of light from a light that is set before you, even if thousands do so, naught is lost therefrom." Now, one of the reasons I'm showing this to you is I wanted to point out a little bit of the technique here, and as we get closer to it, and this is the great thing about works on paper, when you come to into the Achenbach and we take a box of prints out and put the print in front of you, you can take a magnifying glass and look really closely. We spend a lot of our time looking closely at works on paper, and unfortunately, when they're hanging in the gallery and they're under 5-foot candles of light, it's not so simple. But here in the auditorium, I can get some pretty good details. And you can see how the different values are created in an engraving like this. A full range of values from the dark blacks all the way to the highlights, let's say, which usually are just the paper that's been left blank. And what you'll notice about this translation, this graphic translation, is how systematic it is. The cross-hatching in the background in particular is done with very straight lines. Horizontal lines, vertical lines, diagonal lines, all in a kind of very tight grid. This is a very specialized graphic language that became really an international language for engravers in the 17th century, and I'm going to show you quickly just a couple of other examples from the exhibition. The Large Cat by Cornelis Fischer. So this is a print done 30 years after the print we just saw, this time by a Dutch artist who was active in Haarlem. Fischer was also a professional reproductive engraver. A lot of the work that he did was basically translating other artists' designs and paintings into the medium of engraving. But this very special print, The Large Cat, seems to have been his own design. So Fischer was not just a reproductive engraver, he was also an inventor of compositions, and he was really one of the best in this technique among the Dutch in the, let's say, in the early to mid 17th century. So again, I have a nice detail, and when you look very closely at the Fischer cat, and I'm focusing mainly on the background in these engravings, you'll see again this same kind of technique of horizontal lines, vertical lines, diagonal lines, which vary in thickness and which create this essentially all of the different shades and tones from the darkest to the lightest. Because in engraving, as in etching, you can't create a pure tone. In a wood block, you can actually have a large flat area and ink it and print it and get pure black. But in etching and engraving, it's all done using lines, and so very tight networks of lines were necessary to create areas of tone. And I've got one more. This is the Vanitas by Jean Morin, who is a French reproductive engraver. So now we're in an entirely different country, working after Philippe de Champagne, a painting that is now lost, but was done by one of the most important French artists of the 17th century, one of the founders of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, an artist who made many portraits and other kinds of pictures which were reproduced in large numbers by people like Jean Morin. This is a Vanitas still life, not very subtle one, I would say, maybe less subtle than some of the ones you saw that Melissa showed you, with, of course, the ubiquitous, watch, the flowers that are wilting, and naturally the skull, and the Latin inscription which says, "What are earth and ashes to the proud? The hour flies, honor fades, and dark death threatens all." And I'm showing it again because of I just really want to hone in on the technique here and show you how very similar it is, although maybe a little less systematic here, but this is a really nice close-up of that print. And you can see that although the lines are perhaps not put in with a straight edge here, they kind of waver a bit. It's the same idea of cross-hatching. There was a wonderful, actually he wasn't a wonderful person, but he was a wonderful curator named William Ivins at the Metropolitan Museum of Art many years ago, who wrote a famous book in which he coined the phrase net of rationality, a wonderful expression I've loved to use to describe this approach to engraving. The net of rationality was this standard graphic language that was everywhere by the end of the 17th century and continued into the 19th century, so that paintings could be translated into a black and white medium of engraving. And when you look closely at details from these prints, I would be hard-pressed to tell you who the artist is or what the period it is or even what the nationality is, because it's such a standardized graphic language. So when we turn to Rembrandt, we find something very different. Rembrandt's Shell of 1650, which is in Rembrandt's Century next door, a fascinating print that tells us a little bit about Rembrandt's collecting habit. Rembrandt was, throughout his life, was a collector. He was an avid collector. He bought art, lots of it. He bought prints, contemporary prints, old master prints, paintings, but he also bought costume, accessories, and natural objects of curiosity, let's say, exotic seashells, which were being imported into Amsterdam, and he paid huge prices for these things. And he made only one print of a still life, and this is it, the Shell of 1650, and it's a beautiful, beautiful print, not a translation of a painting. Rembrandt rarely based his prints on his own paintings, but something that he invented in the medium of etching. Beautiful balance of black and white on the sheet of paper. And as we get closer to the etching of Rembrandt, you'll see a very different approach to creating tone. It's a completely unsystematic approach. He uses parallel lines which cross each other in almost random ways, and this is nothing like a net of rationality. It's more like a kind of net of irrationality, not based at all on any kind of a regular grid. It's really Rembrandt speaking his own graphic language, one that he invents. And turning for a second to a fascinating print, the artist drawing from the model of 1639. This is an etching that Rembrandt started and left incomplete. This is how it ended up in 1639. The plate, in fact, still exists. It's in the collection of the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam, one of about 81 Rembrandt plates that survive out of a total of maybe 290 that he created. Rembrandt could have finished this print, I suppose. He could have also taken this plate and used it for another purpose, but he didn't. He didn't destroy it. He actually printed it, and he seems to have printed it over the course of some years and allowed it to be distributed and collected by people who liked his work. It was, who knows why he stopped. Something wasn't working for him, but it's an interesting print because it gives you some insight into his approach to printmaking, which tends to be rather spontaneous. He doesn't work from lots of studies. He takes a dry point needle and he scratches the basic design into the copper and then slowly and methodically starts to fill it in. Now, this would have been a very serious print. It would have obviously taken him a lot of time and effort to finish the whole thing. And it was a print that would have been executed in a very fine manner that is one of the ways that he worked as a printmaker, but not always. And I thought this would be a good image to have on the screen as I just talked briefly about the essentially binary nature of printed images. Prints are binary in the sense that, and I'm speaking of old master prints here, particularly Rembrandt, both in terms of the materials used to make a print, ink and paper, too, and also in terms of the chromatic content of prints. They are black and white. But I want to go on the record as saying that that is a gross oversimplification, because there is it is never true that the black is pure black, and rarely is the paper pure white. And in fact, we know that Rembrandt experimented a lot with different kinds of papers, different color papers, different texture papers, different kinds of papers, including Japanese paper, and printing ink, which is made from different recipes of linseed oil or walnut oil, lamp black, which is a burnt pitch resin turpentine. The recipe could change, and also the condition, of course, of prints can change over the course of time, so that you end up with an object that is not pure black and pure white. But I think you understand what I mean throughout this talk when I speak of black and white. If I were to make a musical analogy, I might say that a Rembrandt painting is like an orchestral work, using all of the different tones and textures of the orchestra and all of its instruments. But an etching is like a work for solo piano, a sonata. But it can have all of the drama and artistry of a painting. It can have the melody and the rhythm of a symphonic work, but it's simply for black and white. One of the things that this print has evidence of is dry point burr, which some of these lines you see have this kind of fuzzy quality to it. That's because when Rembrandt scratches the design into the copper plate, he leaves little bits of copper along the edges of those lines. And when he inks the plate, those little curls of copper, which wear out very fast, they catch the ink and they produce a line that is slightly soft focus. So extending the piano analogy, it's like a sustaining pedal on a piano. It just allows the strings to vibrate. It allows the line to vibrate and resonate in this way. In most Old Master prints, there's a fine balance of power between these two elements, ink and paper. Rembrandt pushes the balance of power from one extreme to another, which I think is one of the things that sets him apart from all of his contemporaries. And so I've got two prints on the screen from the show: the view of Amsterdam on the left from about 1640, and the flight into Egypt, a night piece from about 11 years later. The print on the left, 3/4 of the space is absolutely blank. The sky, the low horizon. This is a sky that has no clouds, no birds, no sun setting, absolutely nothing. It's just paper. And I've said that I really think there's no other print where so much of the print, proportionally speaking, is just empty paper, as in this one. And the other print, which I will come back to, obviously has tipped the balance in the other direction. It's a very, very dark print that we would say is in Rembrandt's dark manner. Christ's preaching from the mid-1650s is a print that we have in the exhibition in two different impressions, and I'm showing you one of them on the screen. I'll show you the other one in a second. There were many religious denominations in the Dutch Republic. The official religion, that is the one that was government supported, was Calvinism. In the 1570s, the Calvinist Reformed Church basically took over all of the Catholic churches, and they took all of the religious imagery out, painting, sculpture, stained glass, which was all considered idolatry. So in that painting that Melissa showed you of an imaginary church interior, you may have noticed that there were no paintings there, unlike in Italy where everything would have been decorated. The significant thing, though, is that the Reformed Church didn't forbid those kinds of images to be in your own house. So you could personally collect prints and paintings representing these religious subjects. And there were Roman Catholics in Amsterdam. They represented a minority of the population. They had to worship in secret churches, but they were there. Rembrandt's mother was a Catholic. His father was a Calvinist. He was raised as a Calvinist, but he had clients representing Catholics, Calvinists, Jews, Mennonites, Remonstrants. So in Rembrandt's work, it's not surprising to find images like this, which would seem to be a very kind of Catholic imagery. This is a mature etching of Rembrandt from the middle of his career toward the end of his career, in fact, beautifully balanced and harmonious composition. And influenced by Raphael's frescoes in the Stanza della Segnatura, Rembrandt collected reproductive engravings, and that's how he knew Italian works, for example, since Rembrandt himself never set foot outside of Holland. If I kind of go back and forth, unfortunately these two images don't quite match up exactly, but you'll see them both in the exhibition, and this is going to make everybody a little sick if I keep doing this, but you'll see that there are, although a lot of it looks exactly the same, there are areas, and I can't coordinate all of these buttons at the same time, that get darker and lighter. So this print early on became known as a white sleeve impression to distinguish it from ones where, particularly referring to this area of the onlooker, the sleeve was dark. And we have impressions of both the dark sleeve and the white sleeve in our collection. It's unfortunately we don't have a lot of this kind of thing in San Francisco's collection in terms of showing lots of variation on Rembrandt's way of printing, but this is the one place where we can do it. And this is a close-up of that same passage from both of these impressions. The black sleeve obviously on the left, the white sleeve on the right. And one of the things you may notice is that the lines look pretty much the same, but there's this kind of foggy, atmospheric, furry ink on the black sleeve impression, which is caused by that dry point burr. In this instance, it's thought that the dry point burr actually, this does not represent a print where the dry point burr wore out, but that Rembrandt proactively smoothed that burr down. And the reason I say that is because the white sleeve impressions are all excellent impressions, and many of them on the same kind of paper as the black sleeve impressions, which means that they were done about the same time. Early in his career, Rembrandt made some pictures that were highly theatrical and reflect this kind of international interest in the art of people like Caravaggio in Rome. As I said, Rembrandt never went to Rome, but many other artists did, some Dutch artists from Utrecht in particular, where there was a good connection between Utrecht, the very Catholic city, and Rome. And so pictures were brought back, and the young Rembrandt and his friend and colleague Jan Lievens, an artist who was very close in age, who studied with alongside Rembrandt with the same master and worked very closely together in Leiden in the late 1620s, would have been exposed to these kinds of pictures. And even though there was no real demand for large-scale paintings like this from official sources in Holland, I think the young artists just wanted to show that they could do one of these ambitious kinds of pictures. The subject of both of these prints is the Raising of Lazarus, a story told in the Gospel of St. John. Lazarus was the brother of Mary Magdalene, who died, and then Jesus came 4 days later and commanded the stone to be removed from his tomb, and Lazarus, lo and behold, emerged. And this was a kind of foreshadowing of the resurrection. This was a popular subject of Baroque painters, particularly Catholic painters, and Jan Lievens made a painting of this subject, and there it is, it's in Brighton now, and his etching was based rather directly on the painting. In fact, it's essentially a reproduction of the painting, although everything is flipped backwards, the nature of printing. And the relationship between these works by Rembrandt and Lievens is very complicated and convoluted because the dating of both versions of the paintings are not entirely clear. And Rembrandt made a copy in red chalk of the Levens painting and acquired it. In fact, it was in this painting was in Rembrandt's own collection. It was listed in the inventory of 1656 at the time that he went bankrupt. It's interesting to compare Rembrandt's treatment with Levens, and it's also particularly interesting to compare Rembrandt's etching with the painting that he made, which is at LACMA. And you'll see that unlike Levens, Rembrandt approached the print, basically decided to reinterpret the theme altogether. Although Lazarus, the figure of Lazarus himself is pretty much the same and reversed, the rest of the scene has shifted. In fact, our whole viewpoint has changed. And it becomes more about the reaction of the bystanders. X-rays have been done on these paintings showing changes that the paintings experienced. The prints go through various states. We don't know who, if anybody, commissioned these two works, keeping in mind that the Calvinist Church would have forbidden this kind of picture. So it's not entirely clear who's copying who in this case, but it's a very interesting example of an early Rembrandt painting and print in which there is this interest in dramatic theatrical lighting. Another good example of this, a painting that's not here in San Francisco, sadly, but it's a painting that you can see in Paris, The Supper at Emmaus, an oil on paper on panel, done early on in Rembrandt's career. This was the scene where after the resurrection, Jesus runs into two of his disciples who don't recognize him, but they invite him in for supper. It was the subject of a very famous painting by Caravaggio, but Rembrandt's source was not Caravaggio, but another artist active in Rome who was terribly important in this genre of dark, dramatic pictures. His name was Adam Elsheimer, and this is his oil on copper of Jupiter and Mercury in the house of Philemon and Bocchus. He was a German painter active in Rome who specialized in small, tiny cabinet pictures, mostly done on copper. He only made about 40 paintings, very small output. And this painting in Dresden was done in about 1608. An uncommon subject. Usually this scene is set outdoors, but it's from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it's a very similar story. This elderly couple gives hospitality to two travelers, not realizing that they are, in fact, Jupiter and Mercury. And as they are dining in their little cottage, the wine bowl replenishes itself, and they realize that these are, in fact, gods. And in gratitude, they are told, "Get out of town. We're going to destroy the whole place because nobody here took care of us." And so Jupiter and Mercury stand in for God the Father and Christ in this story. Rembrandt may not have known that painting, but he certainly knew the engraving done by Hendrik Hout, who was a key figure in all of this and somebody who's given a lot of wall space in the exhibition Rembrandt's Century. This is his engraving after the painting, done in 1612. And Hout was a curious figure. He was apparently a painter too, but none of his paintings survive. He was Dutch, but he stayed with Adam Elsheimer in Rome, apparently lived with him for a period of time, may have studied with him, was also his patron, apparently lent him money, and Elsheimer, who ended up in debtor's prison, had a falling out with Hout, who left and returned to Utrecht, bringing with him some of Elsheimer's paintings, but also he is the person who made sure that everybody knew Elsheimer's work through these engravings. And Hout's engravings are not just your standard reproductive engravings. They were very special prints. He was also a calligrapher. He was very proud of his skills as a calligrapher, so all of his prints have these elaborate inscriptions, which also always include his title. He'd been given some sort of a title as a papal count when he was in Italy, where he converted to Catholicism. The painting on the left, the thing about Elsheimer, as I say, is his paintings are very rare, and some of them don't survive and are only known through copies. The painting on the left is at the National Gallery in London. It's one of two versions of this famous composition of Tobias and the Angel. The other one is in Copenhagen, but the original is lost. The painting is also known, again, through the engraving by Hout. The story here being that Tobias has been sent by his dad to go out to collect a debt, and on the way he meets the archangel Raphael in disguise, who tells him how to make medicine to cure his father's blindness using the gallbladder of the fish. So they're on their way, and this is an incredible engraving by Hout that is, again, one of the prints that Rembrandt would have known. He would have known either directly or through a copy. And I have a couple of details of this just to show his technique, which was really unusual. Before you saw that kind of network of cross-hatching, you saw Rembrandt's very different approach, and Hout's incredibly fine technique. Who knows how he did this with some kind of magnifying glass. He must have had incredible hand-eye coordination. These are tiny, tiny little lines, and he's able to produce the quality of almost tone, the illusion of tone in engraving, which is very, very difficult. Hout's print of Tobias and the Angel was copied by another very strange artist named Hercules Segers, a financially challenged Dutch painter from Haarlem, who was also a printmaker, very experimental printmaker, and an artist that we know that Rembrandt admired a great deal. Rembrandt owned 8 of his paintings, and at some point he acquired the plate, the copper plate of Segers, which had this on it, this being a copy of Hout's Tobias and the Angel. And oddly, very strangely, uniquely, bizarrely, Rembrandt took this plate and reworked it. And again, I've got a sort of fancy crossfade going on here between Segers and Rembrandt. This is Rembrandt's version, which is in our exhibition. And if you look very closely in the upper right corner, you'll see the remains of the wing of the archangel, which still show through. Obviously, he's changed the scale. The scale of the landscape changes completely, and so does the subject. It becomes a rest on the flight into Egypt. But the landscape is essentially Segers, although it's Segers copying Hout, copying Elsheimer. Very long chain of relationships here. And the composition is actually quite similar to one of Elsheimer's most famous paintings. This is an oil on copper from Munich, which is not here, but it's a magnificent and magical nocturne, one of the most important nocturnes painted in the 17th century. It's about 12 by 16 inches, painted on copper in this very fine technique. It dates from the very end of Elsheimer's short career. He was only 32 when he died, and made this painting. And it follows, it's the first painting known to follow St. Matthew's text to actually set the rest on the flight in a nocturnal setting rather than in the daytime. And Elsheimer goes to great pains to paint realistically all of these various light sources, the campfire, Joseph's lantern, the moon, the reflection of the moon, the stars. He even represents the Milky Way, the first known painting of the Milky Way, the first known representation of the Milky Way in art. In fact, at some point, some scientists got together and determined that he must have had access to a telescope, because this is how the Milky Way would have appeared if you were in Rome in June of 1609, which is when the painting was done. And this was a painting that Hout brought with him back to Holland in 1610, and 3 years later he engraved it, and our engraving unfortunately lacks all of the calligraphy underneath it, but otherwise a very beautiful impression that preserves the composition, although it flips it. We know that there was at least one copy of Elsheimer's painting that was in Delft in the 1630s and 1640s. There may have been others, and of course this print, which was in circulation and probably known to Rembrandt. In 1647, Rembrandt painted Arrest on the Flight into Egypt. This picture, which is in Dublin, which is very closely indebted to Elsheimer's prototype, was a very, very dark picture, although in recent years it was cleaned and more of the details came out. And I think in this picture, again, you see Rembrandt, like Elsheimer, is interested in the different light sources of the campfire, the moon, this very kind of ominous, dark, threatening landscape where the family is taking refuge in the darkness, and even gives us a very interesting little detail of this is thought to represent the temple in Jerusalem, and the lights are on at night. Light in this picture is really the actor more than the human players. The darkness is the threatening element here. And so when Rembrandt creates an etching of this subject in 1651, he tries to make a hout. He creates one of these profoundly black prints, and there are a number of these in Rembrandt's oeuvre, and this one is actually in our show. I'll show you a couple in a second that are not. Darkness in these works is symbolic of, and it represents the threat faced by the Holy Family. I think I have, yes, a first state, which is at the Metropolitan Museum, which shows how this print and some of Rembrandt's other dark prints start out rather clearer, but as he progressively works on these plates, they tend to get darker and darker and darker to the point where they're actually very difficult to read. And this image projected on the screen is actually a bit more legible than the print when you see it in person. It's a tiny little print, very deceptive to see it projected so large here. I wanted to show you a couple of others that we don't have in our collection to show you how consistent Rembrandt is in his interest in this. This goes back to the 1640s. St. Jerome, a very popular theme of the official Latin, the translator of the Bible, an iconic subject for a Catholic audience in 17th century Holland. And again, one of the blackest, darkest, dark matter prints by Rembrandt. You can barely make out the details of the interior. It takes a while for your eyes to literally adjust to the darkness to make it out. And if I were to show you details of Rembrandt's cross-hatching, again, you would see that it's not regular like Hout or some of the professional engravers I showed you, but it's unsystematic. Rembrandt often leaves a film of ink on the plate to create more tone, and as I showed you earlier, with dry point, he's able to capture ink and pull it around the lines. And the Student by Candlelight, similar candlelight picture. And the Adoration of the Kings, or the Star of the Kings, representing Twelfth Night, the Three Kings' Day, where children are going around the neighborhood with an illuminated star, going from house to house, symbolizing the star that guided the Magi to Bethlehem. This is again by Rembrandt a true dark night picture. It's not day for night as it is in so many of his contemporaries, but it's night for night. And some of Rembrandt's great religious prints of the 1650s take advantage of these effects. The Descent from the Cross by Torchlight, which is one of the most dramatic of Rembrandt's etchings, is part of a series of prints of the life of Christ that he made in the mid-1650s. Incredibly dramatic picture, and as is so often the case in Rembrandt, a very original approach to a subject that's treated in art continuously, but the cross is placed very oddly in the upper left corner. In fact, you only see the base of it. And the dead figure of Christ being taken down with great difficulty from the cross. The torch illuminates the entire scene, very close to where his foot is still hammered to the cross. The central figure in all of this seems to be this man, who we see from behind, struggling to carry the weight of the figure with the shroud below. The print is really about translating this theme into a sort of natural. What would it actually be like? What would the practical reality of getting a corpse down off of this cross really be like? And done with very expressive use of dry point throughout. This is a very beautiful impression of this print that we have, very early impression where the burr is present and the lines are soft and velvety. I'm going to end with two of Rembrandt's most important prints that we're fortunate to have in the exhibition. The Three Trees, which is the largest and the most ambitious of Rembrandt's landscape etchings, a work that is rather dramatic for Rembrandt as a landscape. We call it the Three Trees, but we don't know what Rembrandt called it. The Three Trees, as is true of very many of Rembrandt's prints, was a name that it took on in the 1730s when people started to make catalogs of these prints and had to call them something. So this became known as the Three Trees. And I think it's a print that, on the one hand, represents a real Dutch landscape with a kind of cityscape of the type that you see in the view of Amsterdam, but also with these gigantic trees. And I think the scale of the trees makes this so powerful as compared to all of the tiny little figures. Is a kind of operatic. It's Rembrandt doing an opera in landscape. Rembrandt looking at artists like Rubens, who at the end of his career made many dramatic landscapes with rainbows and storms, weather, which is something that doesn't otherwise really appear in Rembrandt's etchings. And like the Bay Area, there's kind of microclimates going on here. We have an area of brightness and then an area of storminess. And, over the centuries, people have gone back and forth as to whether the storm is coming or going. Are these figures about to get soaked, or is the sun coming out? The trees have been interpreted as representing the three crosses of Calvary, also as a kind of perhaps political allegory about Dutch fortitude. But it's an incredible piece of printmaking. And the details reveal an incredible amount of activity in this landscape. One of my favorite details is the figure of a draftsman seated at the edge of the composition. Uniquely in Rembrandt, the draftsman doesn't face the scene, he faces out. And if we were to scroll down from that seated draftsman into this very dark passage, there's a very little famous passage in this print that is written about a lot. People always have a hard time seeing this. It's a pair of a man and a woman cavorting here in the bushes. And I think she's a little easier to make out than he is in this detail, but I think you can see them. And in fact, I have on the right a detail from a different impression. This is an impression at the Clark where I used to work, which is printed in a slightly different way so that you can see them a little more clearly. I often wondered whether this wasn't some kind of a leftover on the plate that actually didn't belong here, because when you look at them in the context of the overall view, and so now they're down here, the scale is just so radically different and strange. And we do know that Rembrandt did reuse plates. Forgive me for flashing through these so so quickly. But in another etching, in another etched landscape of a bit earlier called the Omval, representing this neighborhood outside of Amsterdam where people used to like to go to take walks, he also has a pair of lovers. The man is putting a wreath on his girlfriend's head. So it may very well have been intentional. The Three Trees is not a dark manner print, but it's a kind of hybrid. One part of the print is done in the dark manner, and one part of the print is not, which is unique in Rembrandt's etched output. And there was a long tradition, incidentally, of these pastoral landscapes. This one is in our exhibition by Goltzius from the turn of the 17th century, often with these little couples, shepherds and shepherdesses sitting around in somewhere in the landscape. Oh, and this slide is out of sequence, but this is the sky and the three trees, and it does have some very curious kinds of drawings of the cloud formations that if you look at them long enough, you start to see maybe angels or heads, and it's never clear whether this is just some leftover from something else that was on the plate, or whether this was really something that just happened by mistake. I'm going to end with the three crosses, but before I put that on the screen, this is a print that I wanted to include in the exhibition, but I ran out of space. So, but here it is. Nicolas De Bruin, who was a rather important engraver in the late 16th, early 17th century in Antwerp, a Flemish printmaker, has been the subject of a new dissertation that I haven't read yet, but he was an ambitious artist who created his own compositions. This is an enormous engraving. It's about this wide, a print that would have been would not have been made to be put into an album, but would have been made to hang up on the wall. And he's looking at artists like Lucas van Leyden to come up with this representation of the crucifixion. And I show it really as an example of a kind of crucifixion scene that is just very, very different when Rembrandt takes up the subject in the mid-1650s. Christ crucified between the two thieves, a print that's become known as the Three Crosses. This is the second state of 5 states. This is not in our show, but this is an impression of the print at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This plate is about 15 by 18 inches, which is very large for Rembrandt. It's a large print. It's a dry point. It's conceived on the scale of a painting, really. And if I were to show you images of all of the states, you would find that in the first 3 states of this print are very similar to each other, and there's a lot of anecdotal detail. You can kind of tell all of the different things that are happening at the scene of the crucifixion. This is Mary Magdalene. This is John. This is the Virgin sort of fainting and collapsing. This is the centurion being, converted at the last moment. And the storytelling is rather clear. He did this plate in dry point. Dry point, I've talked about a little bit, is not really intended to last a very long time. So it's thought that after printing about 40 impressions of this in the first 3 states, it all kind of wore out. And so Rembrandt had to go back to the plate and rework it. But instead of just going over those lines and strengthening it, he reimagined it. He reimagined it in a way that is just completely unexpected and unimaginable to produce this, which is the 4th state from our collection, and which is really the climax of the exhibition in many ways, the climax of Rembrandt's printmaking career. It is a chaotic scene, and if I were to switch back and forth between these 2 images, which don't line up perfectly, you can see that everything has changed except perhaps the Christ on the cross, although even the figure of Christ has changed. He has done a lot of removal of whatever was left of a lot of the figures in the lower left corner. And it's become a scene of chaos. He's also added this new figure that wasn't there before. You see this horse, which is facing the other direction, of this centurion or a soldier. This was something that was taken from a medallion that he must have owned after the 15th century artist Pisanello. And in this dark manner print, Rembrandt seeks to illustrate the Gospel of St. Luke version of the crucifixion, which says, "It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit.' And having said this, he breathed his last." So what we are witnessing in this print is the extinguishing of the light of the world, with these expressionistic, slashing lines that he really seems to have pushed the envelope of elevating the print to the level of painting, and perhaps even beyond that. These lines are almost like wounds on the plate. The dry point where the ink almost seems to bleed out of the lines. It's a scene of distress, pain, anguish, and grief. With this print, Rembrandt has created a true art of darkness out of ink and paper, shattering the net of rationality with marks of raw emotion. And in the final analysis, the medium and the message are one. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question has to do with distinguishing the dry point, the etching, the engraving. A lot of these prints are a combination of different techniques, and it's actually extremely difficult to distinguish them. Scholars who write about these prints endlessly study their surfaces, but in the case of many of Rembrandt's prints, it's such an admixture of techniques overlaid on top of each other. It's very hard to separate a Buren work from, say, a dry point line. The dry point lines are the easiest to see because, you know, they have that characteristic kind of slashing, and you see here, and if there's burr present, they have that sort of soft edge. But, you know, when you look very closely at an etched line, if you can see the ends of it, it'll have blunt ends because the line is being put into the plate using acid that just eats right down into the plate. An engraved line is gouged, and the ends where the Buren goes into the plate and where the Buren comes out of the plate will have a sharp edge. But in so many of these prints, you can't find the edges of the lines, so it's not always that simple to separate them all out. Yeah, engraved lines tend to be deeper than dry point lines. Dry point lines tend to be scratched rather shallow, which is why they go away so fast and wear out. Engraved lines are usually much deeper. The question is about the Enval etching and whether the trees and so forth, the stumps and the foliage are based on reality. Rembrandt certainly went out into the landscape and drew from nature. He didn't necessarily bring his etching plate along with him. And those are certainly natural elements, I'm sure, but recombined to create the print. I don't believe they're invented out of his imagination. Yes? The question is about copper as a painting support. It's less common than canvas, but it was used quite a bit in the 17th century, also in Italy. Copper paintings tended to be smaller in scale. Artists liked copper because it had such a great smooth surface. You could paint meticulously tiny detail on a copper painting. Sometimes, in very rare occasions, a piece of copper that was used to make an etching was then used for a painting. In fact, one of Rembrandt's copper plates was taken at some point by an artist who used the back of it to make a landscape. And in the 1990s, it was rediscovered as having a Rembrandt etching on the other side. It's in the collection of the National Gallery. Anything else? I'll go way up to the top. Plates, yeah, plates can be reused, and they can be burnished down and scraped down and hammered down and made relatively smooth again. Sometimes it's amazing how they'll often leave things on a plate that kind of jump right out at us, but a plate could be smoothed down and reused. And of course, many artists had assistants in their workshops who did that kind of grunt work, but it was certainly possible, and it was done quite a bit. Yeah, the question was about the calligraphy. Hout was a calligrapher, and yes, any writing had to be done backwards. So he had to, when you learned that kind of calligraphy for engraving, you had to do everything in reverse. Rembrandt, of course, when he signs his plates, has to sign them in reverse for his name to appear in the proper direction. Artists have to, something they learn early on, but it's amazing how many times they screw up and one letter turns out backwards, and then they just don't bother to change it. Yes, the question was about etching technique, and yes, you put a ground on your copper plate, a wax substance, and so to make an etching, you're really just scraping the ground, and so you're able to essentially draw in the ground, which is why painters were, for the most part, very comfortable making etchings. Engraving, in contrast, is that physical gouging of the plate, which is almost a kind of sculpting, something that painters wouldn't have known how to do and they wouldn't have wanted to do because it was not like drawing. Well, thank you so much.